Hermelinda Gonzalez was a bright and charismatic young woman, known for her warm smile and an energy that could light up a room. She lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other. It was here that she met Nathaniel Rivers, a charming, ambitious man who quickly became the center of her world. At first, their relationship seemed perfect, almost too good to be true. Friends would later recall how inseparable they were, sharing inside jokes and finishing each other's sentences. But beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic love story, dark undercurrents began to swirl. Nathaniel, while outwardly charismatic, harbored a deep-seated insecurity. He was prone to jealousy, often asking Hermelinda for reassurance in ways that felt more like interrogations. Small questions turned into accusations, innocent outings with friends became points of contention, and the loving man Hermelinda once knew began to show a more controlling side. One evening, Hermelinda attended a co-worker's birthday party. Nathaniel, who had not been invited, waited anxiously at home. His mind raced with intrusive thoughts. Where was she? Who was she with? When Hermelinda finally returned, Nathaniel bombarded her with questions. His voice was sharp, his tone accusatory. Despite her attempts to calm him, the seed of doubt had been planted deep in his mind. Over time, Nathaniel's jealousy began to consume their relationship. He started tracking her whereabouts, constantly checking her phone, and even questioning her colleagues. Hermelinda, once vibrant and full of life, began to withdraw. Friends noticed her growing silence, her reluctance to share details about her relationship. One fateful day, Hermelinda mentioned an old friend, a man she had grown up with, who had recently reached out to reconnect. Nathaniel's reaction was instant and explosive. His face darkened, his voice trembled with anger as he accused her of betraying him. Trust had crumbled, and jealousy had taken root. Nathaniel's paranoia grew into a dangerous obsession. Hermelinda, desperate to salvage their relationship, tried to set boundaries. She encouraged Nathaniel to seek help for his insecurities, but her suggestions only fueled his anger. He began isolating her from friends and family, convincing her that they didn't understand their relationship. One evening, Nathaniel discovered messages on Hermelinda's phone, a casual conversation with her old friend. To Nathaniel, it was confirmation of his worst fears. His mind spiraled into a dark abyss where logic and reason no longer existed. On a cold November night, the tension reached its breaking point. Hermelinda had planned to meet a friend for dinner, a simple, harmless outing. But Nathaniel, consumed by jealousy, demanded to know every detail: where she was going, who she was meeting, and why. Hermelinda, exhausted by his accusations, stood her ground. For the first time, she refused to explain herself, insisting that she deserved trust and freedom. Nathaniel, unable to cope with her defiance, snapped. His jealousy morphed into rage, a rage that would soon have devastating consequences. What happened next would forever change the lives of everyone who knew them and leave an entire community reeling in shock. Police arrived after a neighbor reported hearing a commotion. Inside the house, they found signs of a violent struggle, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and, in the center of it all, Hermelinda's lifeless body. Nathaniel was nowhere to be found. As detectives pieced together the events of that night, a harrowing picture began to emerge. Nathaniel's jealousy had escalated into a violent outburst, and in his rage, he had taken Melinda's life. But where was Nathaniel? The man who had once professed undying love for Melinda had vanished without a trace. Nathaniel checking into a cheap motel several towns away. For days, he evaded authorities, his mind consumed by regret and fear. He knew what he had done, and he knew there was no escape from the consequences. It all began on a cold autumn morning. The sun hung low, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood, but something felt off. A neighbor, Mrs. Edwards, walked her dog down the street like she did every morning. But today, as she passed by the Gonzalez Rivers house, she noticed something strange: an open door, hanging loosely on its hinges. The usual hum of suburban life was absent. The air was still. Mrs. Edwards paused, frowning. She was familiar with Melinda's warm, welcoming nature, but the house stood eerily silent. No music played from the windows, no footsteps echoed in the hallway. She instinctively walked up the porch steps and knocked gently on the door. Nothing. Her concern grew. Something was wrong. Mrs. Edwards quickly dialed the police. When officers arrived, the cold, quiet air turned thick with tension. They approached the door cautiously, exchanging wary glances. The door creaked open under their hands. Inside, the home was quiet, too quiet. At first glance, it appeared to be like any other suburban house. Pictures of a happy couple hung on the walls, furniture neatly arranged, the scent of coffee lingering in the air. But then the officers saw it. A table had been overturned, its contents scattered across the floor: half-empty coffee mugs, a crumpled napkin, and a few scattered pages of Melinda's journal. The chaos was subtle, but enough to suggest a struggle. Chairs were knocked askew, and in the living room, the coffee table had been pushed aside violently. There was a sense of order, and yet, disorder. A home that had been lived in, but now felt like an abandoned crime scene. It wasn't just a messy house, it was the scene of a fight that had spiraled out of control. The officers moved cautiously through the house, their eyes scanning for any clues. Then, in the hallway, they found it. The trail of blood, dark and thick, leading from the living room toward the master bedroom. The investigators followed it silently, their steps heavy in the quiet home. The bedroom door stood ajar. Inside, the bed was disheveled, sheets tangled. And there, in the center of the room, lay Melinda's body. Her once bright eyes were now lifeless, staring blankly at the ceiling. The violent struggle had clearly escalated here. Her body was bruised, the signs of a physical confrontation evident: hands clenched, fingers twisted in unnatural angles. A single red stain spread across her clothes, soaking into the fabric. The scene was chilling. This wasn't just a crime, it was a tragedy. Her life had been taken in an instant, but it wasn't just her life that had been stolen. The very essence of peace, of normalcy, had been ripped away from this community. The detectives carefully examined the room. Evidence was scattered around: a broken lamp, a smashed mirror, and in the corner, a shattered photo frame. The image within was of Melinda and Nathaniel smiling together, frozen in a happier time. Now, It felt like a cruel reminder of the love that had turned twisted. One of the officers found something odd: a torn piece of fabric caught on a jagged corner of the broken mirror. It was part of a shirt, but not Melinda's. The color was dark, almost black. Could it have been Nathaniel's? It was the first real clue that pointed to the man who had once claimed to love her. Though the house was filled with clues, none spoke louder than the bloodstains leading to the back door. The killer hadn't left through the front, he had escaped in a different direction. But where had he gone? The officers turned their attention to the back door, which had been left slightly ajar. A small trail of blood led down the steps, disappearing into the overgrown grass in the backyard. The detectives could feel the weight of every unanswered question. Who could do something like this? Why? And how had it all spiraled out of control so quickly? They began questioning neighbors, trying to piece together the last hours before the crime. No one had seen anything unusual, but the walls of silence had begun to speak in subtle ways. A neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, mentioned hearing shouting from the house the night before. Her windows were open, the cool breeze carrying the sound of raised voices. It wasn't uncommon for couples to argue, but this was different. She recalled hearing a male voice, trembling with anger. It had echoed through the quiet night, and then there was a silence that followed, a silence that lasted far too long. The officers were left with only one conclusion: Nathaniel had been there. Whether he had been part of the fight or not, his presence could not be denied. As the sun set on that autumn day, the officers knew they were just beginning to understand the depth of the horror that had occurred within those walls. The victims were more than just names in a report. They were cherished members of the community. Sarah Thompson, a teacher whose classroom was filled with laughter and learning. Her students adored her, not just for her ability to teach, but for the warmth and compassion she exuded every day. She made each child feel special, always encouraging them to reach for their dreams, no matter how big or small. Parents often spoke of how Sarah had gone above and beyond, staying after school to help students who struggled. Her loss left a void that could never be filled, a silence in the halls of the school that would echo for years to come. Mark Bennett, a father who always made time for his family, was the heart of his home. He worked tirelessly to provide for his wife and two young children. Despite his demanding job, Mark was never too busy for a game of catch in the yard or a bedtime story with his kids. He was the type of man who could brighten anyone's day with a smile, always ready with a kind word or a joke. The loss of Mark was a blow that reverberated through the entire community. His children, now without their father, had to learn how to live without the man who had been their protector and guide. These two lives, Sarah's kindness and Mark's devotion, had been abruptly taken, leaving a gaping hole in the community. But there was more to their story. More than just their roles as teachers, fathers, and friends. They were the bright spots in the lives of those who knew them, their deaths leaving everyone asking the same question: who could do this, and why? As investigators dug deeper into the lives of the victims, they learned more about Sarah and Mark's relationship with Melinda and Nathaniel. The couple had seemed perfect at first glance, charming, devoted, and in love. But as the investigation unfolded, a darker reality emerged. Nathaniel's jealousy was not limited to Melinda alone. He had been deeply suspicious of anyone who came into contact with her. His paranoia extended to Sarah and Mark, who had been close friends of the couple for years. Sarah had been one of the first to notice Nathaniel's growing possessiveness over her Melinda. She had tried to talk to her Melinda about it, urging her to seek help or distance herself from Nathaniel's controlling behavior. But her Melinda, ever the optimist, had brushed it off, believing things would get better on their own. She had confided in Sarah about her struggles with Nathaniel, but it was clear she didn't want to face the harsh reality of her situation. Sarah, worried for her friend, had kept a close eye on the couple, hoping her Melinda would eventually find the strength to escape the toxic relationship. Mark, on the other hand, had known Nathaniel through mutual friends. At first, Mark had found Nathaniel likable enough, though he did notice the subtle signs of tension in the couple's relationship. Nathaniel's quick temper and constant need for reassurance seemed to strain their interactions, but Mark never thought much of it. That is, until one evening when he found himself in a conversation with Nathaniel that made him uneasy. It had been at a neighborhood barbecue, and Mark had been talking to Nathaniel about a recent trip to the lake. Nathaniel had seemed distant at first, distracted, as if his mind was elsewhere. But as the conversation progressed, Mark began to notice Nathaniel's eyes narrowing when he mentioned her Melinda. There was a strange shift in his demeanor, a coldness that hadn't been there before. Nathaniel asked Mark, almost out of nowhere, if he had ever thought about what could happen if someone betrayed you. Mark, taken aback, didn't know how to respond. Nathaniel's tone was calm, but there was something chilling about the way he spoke, as if he was testing the waters for something darker. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Nathaniel had been planning something for a long time. His jealousy, fueled by insecurity and fear, had been festering for months. The tension in his relationship with her Melinda had reached a boiling point, and when he finally snapped, it was no longer just about her. It was about his twisted sense of ownership over her, his need to control and dominate. Sarah and Mark, innocent bystanders, had become targets in his distorted world. Their kindness, their friendship with her Melinda, had made them enemies in Nathaniel's eyes. The night of the murder, as Nathaniel's rage boiled over, it was clear that his plan was set in motion. He believed that if he couldn't have her Melinda, no one could. And Sarah and Mark, who had tried to intervene in their troubled relationship, had to pay the price for it. As the investigators sifted through the layers of Nathaniel's mind, they began to uncover the twisted thoughts that had led him to commit such an unthinkable act. His jealousy, his insecurity, had turned into something far darker, something that no one could have predicted. Nathaniel had been consumed by a dangerous obsession, and in his mind, there was no escaping the wrath he had unleashed. Sarah and Mark had been mere obstacles in his path, standing in the way of his vision of an ideal relationship, a vision that, tragically, had led to their deaths. As the investigation progressed, it became apparent that Nathaniel had planned every detail. From the moment her Melinda had met Sarah and Mark to the final, fatal confrontation, Nathaniel had manipulated the situation to his advantage. He had turned his paranoia into a weapon, isolating her Melinda from everyone she trusted. And in the end, it was his jealousy that drove him to murder. But as the investigators closed in on Nathaniel, The question remained, how had it gone so far? How had the man who once professed his love for her Melinda become the monster who took everything from her and from everyone who knew her? Detectives began piecing together the puzzle, each fragment of evidence offering a glimpse into the dark truth behind the crime. From witness interviews to forensic evidence, every clue mattered. They knew they had to dig deep into the lives of everyone involved. It was not a random act. No, this was something far more personal. The first step in any investigation was always the same: interviews. Witnesses had been questioned, but no one had seen anything that could directly identify Nathaniel as the killer. The neighbors had only heard the argument the night before, a faint but angry shouting that they couldn't fully make out. Still, there were details that didn't add up. The officers noted one key fact: no one had seen Nathaniel leave the house that night. The back door, though open, had shown no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had simply slipped away into the night. But how? Why? And where was he now? As they reviewed the crime scene photographs, a forensic technician pointed out a detail they had initially missed: traces of blood found outside the back door, leading into the backyard. The blood trail was small, almost insignificant at first glance, but it was enough to suggest someone had been injured. Nathaniel. The officers began to suspect that Nathaniel, in his frantic escape, had been wounded during the confrontation. Could that injury be the key to finding him? Close relationships often mean secrets, and uncovering those secrets is no easy task. But in the case of Nathaniel and her Melinda, those secrets were not buried as deeply as they thought. Detective Harris, the lead investigator, felt the weight of those words. As he reviewed the case files, he focused on one particular detail: Nathaniel's behavior in the months leading up to the murder. He wasn't just angry, he was obsessed. Nathaniel had a history of volatile relationships, each one ending in chaos and manipulation. His jealousy was a known issue, and friends and family had often tried to intervene, but his charm had always won them over. One interview, in particular, stood out to Detective Harris. It was with a close friend of Nathaniel's, someone who had known him for years: Chris Daniels. Chris had always been there for Nathaniel during rough times, listening to his complaints and trying to offer support. But recently, he had noticed a change in Nathaniel. Chris described how Nathaniel had become increasingly fixated on her Melinda's interactions with others. He was obsessed with where she was, who she was with, and even checked her social media constantly. At first, Chris thought it was just normal relationship anxiety. But then it became clear that Nathaniel's jealousy was spiraling out of control. "I remember one time," Chris said, shifting uneasily in his chair, "Nathaniel got all worked up over a simple comment on one of her Melinda's photos. It was a guy, just a friend of hers, but Nathaniel was furious. He kept saying, 'She belongs to me. She's mine.' I tried to tell him he was overreacting, but he wouldn't listen." Chris's statement sent a chill down the detective's spine. It confirmed what they suspected: Nathaniel's obsession with her Melinda had been building for months, and when things spiraled out of control, Sarah and Mark had become collateral damage. The question now was whether Nathaniel had planned the murder in advance or if it was an outburst fueled by rage. The more they dug, the more it became apparent that Nathaniel had planned it all. His social media activity was riddled with obsessive posts about her Melinda, and his messages to her in the weeks leading up to the murder were filled with accusations and demands. Why did you go out with him? Who is he? You don't love me like you used to. These messages, all recovered from her Melinda's phone, revealed the depth of Nathaniel's jealousy and his desperation to control her. As the investigation deepened, the detectives realized they weren't just uncovering evidence of a crime, they were uncovering a twisted love story, one where obsession and jealousy had festered until they led to murder. A search of Nathaniel's apartment yielded even more chilling findings. Among his personal belongings, the detectives discovered a notebook filled with handwritten notes, ranting, paranoid scribbles about her Melinda. There were sketches of her, with XS drawn over her eyes, and several pages dedicated to a list of people Nathaniel considered threats to his relationship with her. Sarah and Mark were near the top of that list. This was no longer just a case of a crime of passion. It was a premeditated act, fueled by a twisted sense of ownership. Nathaniel had viewed her Melinda not as an equal partner but as a possession, one that he believed was rightfully his and no one else's. With every new piece of evidence, it became more and more evident that Nathaniel had become a man consumed by his own demons. And with that obsession, he had sealed the fate of those he once claimed to love. The detectives now knew that their next steps were crucial. They had to find Nathaniel before he disappeared forever. They pieced together the small details: his last known whereabouts, his known associates, and his routine. But there was still one critical piece they were missing: where he was hiding. The blood trail, though small, had been a clue. It suggested that Nathaniel had sustained an injury during the struggle, and someone with an injury would eventually seek medical help. The detectives worked with local hospitals and clinics, checking for any recent admissions under Nathaniel's name. It wasn't long before they got a hit. Nathaniel had checked into a nearby urgent care clinic just hours after the murder. The clinic staff had noted a man fitting his description, bleeding from a deep gash on his arm. He had left without providing any personal information, but the detectives now knew they were close. It wasn't just a chase for justice, it was a race against time. The clock was ticking, and Nathaniel was on the run. As the investigation continued, a chilling truth began to surface. Nathaniel was not the only one with a dark side. Her Melinda, who had once seemed like the picture of devotion, was not as innocent as she appeared. In fact, she had been manipulating Nathaniel for years. She had carefully crafted a persona: someone who was loving, caring, and supportive, while secretly weaving a web of lies and deceit that entangled everyone around her, especially Nathaniel. The more the detectives uncovered, the clearer it became that her Melinda's influence over Nathaniel had been profound. But what was her motivation? Why did she feel the need to control him, to twist the love between them into something toxic? Was it love gone wrong, or was there something far darker lurking beneath her actions? At the start, their relationship had seemed like any other. They had met through mutual friends, a chance encounter that seemed destined to happen. Nathaniel had fallen for her Melinda almost instantly: her beauty, her charm, and her seemingly effortless way of making him feel special. But as their relationship deepened, cracks began to appear. Her Melinda had always been a master of manipulation, playing on Nathaniel's insecurities to keep him hooked. She would feed him compliments, only to quickly undermine his confidence with subtle criticisms. She would make him feel needed and loved, only to pull away when he became too attached, creating a constant sense of emotional instability. Nathaniel, desperate for her affection, had been unable to see the patterns. He believed that his love for her was the reason she behaved this way, that he had to try harder, be better, to win her heart. But the truth was much darker. Melinda had used Nathaniel as a tool to get what she wanted: attention, control, and power. She knew exactly how to push his buttons, how to make him feel like he was losing her, and how to manipulate him into doing whatever she wanted. She had convinced him that no one else could love him the way she did, even as she secretly pulled away, making him more desperate and more dependent on her. One of the key elements of Melinda's control over Nathaniel had been her use of technology. She knew that Nathaniel would always be accessible, always checking his phone. And so, she used that to her advantage. Late-night texts, cryptic social media posts, and phone calls designed to keep him on edge, each one a carefully crafted move in her game. "Why haven't you called me yet? You never listen to me. You're so distant lately, is there someone else?" These were just a few of the messages Nathaniel had received from Melinda, each one designed to create doubt in his mind and reinforce her hold over him. But her manipulation didn't stop there. Melinda had also been playing a dangerous game with Nathaniel's emotions, intentionally fostering jealousy and mistrust. She had led him to believe that Sarah and Mark were a threat to their relationship, even though they had been nothing but supportive friends. She used Nathaniel's jealousy as a weapon, knowing that it would push him to become possessive and controlling. Melinda's lies and manipulation were the seeds of destruction, and as Nathaniel's jealousy grew, so did his paranoia. But what was it that finally pushed him over the edge? What turned his obsessive love into a deadly rage? As the detectives sifted through more of Melinda's interactions with Nathaniel, they discovered something even more disturbing. Melinda had been seeing someone else. Not just anyone, but someone Nathaniel would have considered a friend, someone who had been a part of their social circle for years. She had been leading this person on, keeping them in the shadows while simultaneously keeping Nathaniel close. Luke had been a friend of the couple for a long time. He was someone Nathaniel trusted, someone who had been there during good times and bad. But Melinda had been flirting with Luke behind Nathaniel's back, sending him private messages and meeting him in secret. The detectives found texts between them, texts that were filled with hints of a more intimate relationship, though Melinda had carefully disguised them as harmless flirtation. Nathaniel, oblivious to the affair, had only seen the surface, the friendly smiles, the casual conversations. But in reality, Melinda had been stringing him along while she secretly kept Luke as an option. The affair had been another layer in her web of deceit, and Nathaniel's jealousy had been the perfect tool to keep him from suspecting anything. Melinda's actions had pushed Nathaniel to the brink. Her manipulations had led him to believe that no one could love him the way she did, that he needed her, needed to control her, in order to keep her by his side. And in the end, it was that very jealousy, that need for control, that led to murder. As the detectives pieced together the timeline of events, they realized that Melinda's involvement in the tragedy went far beyond just a toxic relationship. She had been a willing participant in Nathaniel's downward spiral, enabling his jealousy, his insecurity, and ultimately, his deadly actions. She had been playing a dangerous game of manipulation, pushing Nathaniel further and further until the weight of it all broke him. Nathaniel, consumed by his own insecurities, had snapped. He had become convinced that if he couldn't have her Melinda, no one else could. But the real tragedy was that her Melinda, the woman he loved, had been the one who had pushed him to the point of no return. The detectives knew they were closing in on the truth, but the question remained, how far was her Melinda willing to go to protect herself? Was she the mastermind behind Nathaniel's actions, or was she just a passive player in a twisted love story gone wrong? The investigation was far from over. As the detectives delved deeper into her Melinda's role in the crime, they realized that the truth was more complex than they had imagined. But one thing was certain: this was no ordinary case of jealousy. This was a love so toxic, it had led to murder. In today's world, technology connects us, but it can also be a tool for harm. Her Melinda knew this all too well. While Nathaniel trusted her, she had been using technology to monitor his every move, manipulating him through a network of apps, messages, and tracking software. In the age of instant communication, it was easy to weave a web of deceit, and she had done just that, exploiting every digital tool at her disposal to keep Nathaniel under her control. The investigators knew they needed to dig into the digital traces left behind. Phones, social media accounts, messages, each one held a clue that could unlock the mystery. In the modern age, everything was traceable. And in this case, the digital footprint her Melinda had left behind was the key to understanding how deeply she had embedded herself into Nathaniel's life. Her Melinda had used several methods to keep tabs on Nathaniel, and her tools were many. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was found in Nathaniel's phone. The detectives discovered that her Melinda had installed a location tracking app on his phone without his knowledge. It wasn't just a simple tool to monitor where he was, it was a means of controlling his movements, ensuring he was never too far from her reach. Every time Nathaniel went out, every step he took was documented. The app sent her notifications, his location, the time of day, and even the route he took. It was clear that her Melinda wasn't just tracking him out of concern. No, this was about power. She wanted to know where Nathaniel was at all times, and if he strayed too far from her, she would know. This level of control didn't come from love, it came from obsession. The detectives combed through Nathaniel's phone records, looking for signs of communication between him and her Melinda in the days leading up to the murder. What they found was a disturbing pattern. Nathaniel had been receiving a steady stream of messages from her Melinda, messages that seemed benign at first glance but were laced with hidden meanings. "Where are you? I haven't heard from you in hours. You didn't reply to my text. Is everything okay? Why are you ignoring me? I'm starting to feel like you're pulling away." These were just a few of the texts that flooded Nathaniel's inbox. On the surface, they seemed like the kind of messages someone would send to a partner who was concerned. But the repeated nature of the texts combined with the underlying sense of urgency and control painted a different picture. Her Melinda was not just checking in, she was subtly reminding Nathaniel that he belonged to her, that she expected his undivided attention, and that any deviation from this would not be tolerated. Through the digital records, the detectives saw how Melinda's grip on Nathaniel had tightened over time. Every message, every call, and every notification was another strand in the web of manipulation that kept him from seeing the truth. The detectives also discovered something chilling. The tracking app had not only monitored Nathaniel's whereabouts but had also created a detailed map of his movements. One particular route stood out. It was a path Nathaniel had taken just days before the murder, leading to a park on the outskirts of town. The app had recorded every stop he made along the way, including the time he spent at each location. This was no ordinary walk. It was as though Nathaniel had been retracing his steps, revisiting the places where he and Melinda had shared moments together. And it wasn't lost on the investigators that the park was where Nathaniel had first met Mark, one of the victims. Had Melinda been aware of this meeting? Was this a calculated move to fuel Nathaniel's jealousy once again? The detectives didn't have all the answers yet, but they could see the pattern forming, a pattern of control and manipulation that was carefully hidden behind the screens of their devices. But it wasn't just location tracking apps and text messages that Melinda had used to maintain control over Nathaniel. Her influence stretched across their entire digital lives. She had access to his social media accounts, and she made sure to monitor his interactions with others. Every time Nathaniel posted a picture or commented on someone's post, Melinda would scrutinize it, often sending passive-aggressive messages or making subtle remarks to assert her dominance. "Why are you talking to her? She doesn't look like the type of girl you should be hanging out with. I saw your comment on his photo. Are you flirting with him?" These comments, though seemingly casual, were part of a much larger effort to isolate Nathaniel from his friends, his family, and anyone who posed a threat to Melinda's control. She didn't just want him physically close, she needed to dominate him emotionally, mentally, and digitally. By keeping him on edge, she ensured that he would remain under her thumb. Melinda's use of technology wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a weapon. It allowed her to manipulate Nathaniel from a distance, to control him even when they weren't in the same room. She had become a master of the digital age, using the very tools designed to connect people to create a world of isolation and paranoia for Nathaniel. The detectives knew they had uncovered only the tip of the iceberg. As they dug deeper into the digital records, they found more evidence of Melinda's manipulative behavior. From emails to social media posts, everything pointed to one thing: Melinda had been playing a dangerous game, and Nathaniel had been her pawn. One of the most telling discoveries came when the investigators accessed Melinda's private messages. They uncovered a hidden conversation between Melinda and Luke, the man she had been seeing behind Nathaniel's back. These messages revealed how she had been carefully orchestrating her relationship with both men, feeding Nathaniel's jealousy while secretly meeting with Luke. "Don't worry, he'll never find out. I know how to keep him in line. We have to be careful, but he's obsessed. He'll never leave me." These messages were chilling. Melinda wasn't just playing with Nathaniel's emotions, she was playing a game with both of their lives, manipulating the situation to her advantage while keeping both men tethered to her. The role of technology in this case was undeniable. It had been the tool that allowed Melinda to carry out her twisted manipulation, to control Nathaniel from a distance, and to hide her affair with Luke. But in the end, it was that same technology that would lead to her downfall. Because in a world where everything is connected, nothing stays hidden for long. When Melinda and Nathaniel were brought in for questioning, the detectives knew this was the moment that would begin to unravel the tangled web of lies and deceit. The sterile, cold room dimly lit, with a table separating the investigators from the suspects, was where the truth would finally come to light. But as they sat across from the officers, both of them seemed unnervingly calm, as though they had rehearsed their answers. The first to be questioned was Melinda. She sat upright, hands folded neatly on the table, her eyes darting nervously from one detective to the other. She seemed poised, but her body language told a different story. Her fingers tapped nervously on the surface of the table, betraying the calm exterior she was trying to project. Her responses were measured, but there was a slight tremor in her voice when she answered simple questions, like when asked about her whereabouts on the night of the murder. "I was at home, alone," she said, her voice steady, but a hint of uncertainty lingered. The detectives didn't buy it. They had already seen the inconsistencies in her statements. She had said she was alone, but they had evidence that suggested otherwise. They had uncovered phone records that showed she had been in communication with Luke, her secret lover, around the time of the murders. Yet, when confronted with these details, Melinda became defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about. I told you, I was by myself," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. The defensive posture was becoming more apparent, her arms folded across her chest, her legs crossed tightly. She was trying to distance herself from the investigation, but the detectives were not so easily deterred. Then it was Nathaniel's turn. Unlike Melinda, his demeanor was visibly anxious. He fidgeted in his seat, avoiding eye contact as much as possible. His eyes kept darting toward the door, as if searching for an escape. His hands were shaking as he rested them on the table, and his breathing was shallow. He couldn't keep still. Every few seconds, he wiped his sweaty palms on his pants, a subtle yet telling sign of his nervousness. When asked about the events leading up to the murders, Nathaniel gave vague, inconsistent answers. He was unsure of where he had been at certain times, and he couldn't recall key details about his whereabouts. It was as if he was deliberately avoiding the truth or, worse yet, trying to block out the events entirely. I don't know what happened," Nathaniel stammered, his voice cracking with fear. "I was just trying to fix things with Melinda. I didn't want anyone to get hurt." The detectives exchanged a look. Nathaniel's response was too vague. It sounded like someone who was trying to convince himself of his innocence more than he was trying to convince the investigators. His words seemed rehearsed, but his body told another story. His foot tapped nervously against the floor, his head shaking ever so slightly as if trying to clear his thoughts. The tension in the room grew thicker. The detectives knew they had to push harder, to break through the walls of silence and denial. They slid a photo of the victims Sarah and Mark onto the table, watching Nathaniel closely for his reaction. Nathaniel's eyes flickered to the photo, and his face drained of color. His lips trembled, and his gaze quickly dropped to his hands. His body tensed as if he were trying to suppress a rush of emotions. It was clear that the sight of the victims had shaken him. But whether it was guilt or grief, the detectives couldn't tell. "You know these people," the detective said softly, leaning forward. Sarah and Mark, your friends. What happened to them? Nathaniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hesitated for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for this to happen, he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself. It all got out of hand. I don't know what came over me. The confession was a crack in his defense, but it wasn't enough. The detectives needed more. They needed to know why Nathaniel had been so easily manipulated, why he had allowed himself to become so ensnared in Hermelinda's lies. Hermelinda, meanwhile, was watching Nathaniel carefully, her expression unreadable. She had been silent throughout most of his questioning, but now, a subtle shift occurred. Her gaze flicked toward the detective sitting closest to her, and she seemed to wait for him to ask the right question. She was playing the game, waiting for Nathaniel to slip up, to say something that would make his guilt more apparent. But as she sat there, a slight smirk tugged at the corner of her lips, a smirk that only those who knew her true nature could decipher. She was enjoying this, enjoying the power she held over Nathaniel and the investigation. As the questioning continued, it became a game of cat and mouse. The detectives were trying to break them, to get them to confess, but Hermelinda and Nathaniel were both playing their parts. Hermelinda's cold, calculating demeanor was a stark contrast to Nathaniel's frantic attempts to hide the truth. But each subtle gesture, each nervous tick, brought the investigators closer to the truth. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. At last, the breakthrough came in the form of the text messages, the same messages that had been discovered during the digital investigation. The detectives projected them onto the wall, displaying a string of conversations between Hermelinda and Nathaniel. The messages were chilling, filled with jealousy, manipulation, and subtle threats. Don't talk to her again. Why are you being so distant? I can't live without you, Nathaniel. You don't want to make me upset, do you? Hermelinda's voice was calm as she read the messages aloud. Those messages, they were just out of concern. I loved Nathaniel. I was just trying to help him. But the detectives knew better. The messages spoke for themselves, revealing a pattern of control and manipulation. They could see the mental and emotional toll it had taken on Nathaniel. Each message, each threat, had been a piece of the puzzle. Slowly, but surely, the facade began to crumble. With every question, every confrontation, the truth was starting to surface. The detectives knew they were getting closer to uncovering the full extent of Hermelinda and Nathaniel's twisted love story. As the investigation reached its peak, the walls around Hermelinda and Nathaniel began to close in. The detectives were now certain that they were the ones responsible for the heinous crime. But, desperate and cornered, the couple made one final attempt to escape justice. It was a stormy night, one that seemed almost symbolic of the chaos and desperation that was about to unfold. A heavy downpour had begun, flooding the streets and turning the landscape into a blur of darkness. The storm was relentless, the wind screaming like a creature trapped in the night. In the midst of this fury, Hermelinda and Nathaniel, fearing that their time had run out, decided to flee. They packed a few bags, grabbed whatever cash they could find, and planned to disappear into the night. But they hadn't planned on the storm. The rain came in sheets, the kind that made driving nearly impossible. Roads became slick and dangerous, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Melinda and Nathaniel, in their haste, hadn't calculated the severity of the weather. They tried to drive through the storm, desperate to escape the law that was closing in on them, but fate had other plans. Law enforcement, aware that the suspects might try to flee, had been preparing for this very moment. The storm, while a hindrance to many, worked to the advantage of the authorities. They had set up roadblocks on every possible route, anticipating that Melinda and Nathaniel would try to escape through the narrow, backcountry roads. The officers had been tipped off about their potential flight and were waiting, ready to act. As the couple's car approached the roadblock, they saw the flashing lights up ahead. Panic set in. Nathaniel slammed his foot on the gas, trying to speed through the barricade, but it was too late. The storm had turned the roads into a slippery mess, and the car skidded uncontrollably. The car veered off the road, splashing through puddles and finally coming to a halt in a muddy ditch. The impact wasn't severe, but it was enough to leave the vehicle stuck, unable to move. Nathaniel tried to restart the engine, but the rain and mud had taken their toll, rendering the car immobile. Before they could react, the police swarmed the area. The storm had done nothing to slow their pursuit, and the officers were quick to approach the vehicle, guns drawn, shouting commands. Melinda and Nathaniel had nowhere to go. Nathaniel was the first to be yanked from the car, his face pale and trembling. His hands were raised in defeat, the adrenaline that had once fueled his escape attempt now replaced by the cold realization that there was no getting away. Melinda, too, was pulled from the car. Her once confident demeanor had completely vanished. Her face was wet with rain and tears, her eyes wide with fear. The storm that had once seemed like a desperate escape route now mirrored the turmoil inside her. The officers placed the handcuffs on them, and as they were escorted to a waiting police vehicle, the storm seemed to intensify, as though nature itself was mourning the tragic events that had transpired. The sound of thunder echoed in the distance, but the real storm, the one created by their actions, had already passed. Justice had caught up with them, and there would be no escape. The final confrontation was swift and tense. Melinda and Nathaniel's attempts to flee had been futile, their hope of escaping justice washed away by the very storm they had hoped would cover their tracks. It had been a desperate, tragic attempt to outrun the inevitable, but as always, the truth had a way of catching up. As they were driven away in the back of a police car, the storm raged on around them, but inside that vehicle, the storm of lies, manipulation, and murder had finally calmed. The twisted love that had driven them to these extremes was over. The storm eventually passed, but the scars they left on the community, the lives they shattered, would remain forever. The pain of losing Sarah and Mark was not something that could be washed away by the rain. It would stay with the town, with the people who had known them, long after the storm had passed. For Melinda and Nathaniel, there would be no more running. No more escaping the truth of their actions. The final act in their twisted love story had come to an end, but the consequences would echo through the lives they had destroyed. And in the end, it was not the storm that washed them away, it was their own choices that led them to this fate. As the dust settled and the storm passed, the community began to pick up the pieces of the tragedy that had unfolded. It was a time of reflection, of grappling with the harsh reality that the lives of two innocent people had been taken, and that the twisted web of deceit and jealousy had led to their untimely deaths. This story is more than just about a crime. It's a stark reminder of the fragility of trust, the complexity of human emotions, and the dangers of unchecked desires. Love, when it is twisted by insecurity and control, can become something dark and destructive. The line between affection and obsession can be razor thin, and once crossed, it can lead to devastating consequences. It's easy to forget, in the fast-paced nature of our lives, how important trust is in our relationships. We get caught up in the small things, the distractions, the frustrations, the misunderstandings. But at the core of every relationship, whether it's between friends, family, or romantic partners, trust is what holds everything together. Without it, everything begins to unravel. In Melinda and Nathaniel's case, the trust that once existed between them had been eroded by jealousy, suspicion, and a desire for control. The manipulation, the surveillance, the lies, it was all a reflection of deep-rooted insecurities and a need to dominate another person. But in the end, that need for control destroyed everything. What could have been a loving, supportive relationship turned into a nightmare that ended in violence. Sarah and Mark were not just victims, they were people who had been loved, who had cared for others deeply. Sarah, the teacher who touched the lives of so many young students. Mark, the father who always put his family first. Their loss left an undeniable void in the community, a hole that couldn't be filled. But as the people who knew them gathered to mourn, they also found solace in the support of one another. In the face of tragedy, unity became their strength. For the community, the pain of losing Sarah and Mark would never go away. The memories of their warmth, their laughter, and the love they had shared would always remain, but the lesson from their deaths was clear: trust is fragile, and when it's broken, the consequences can be catastrophic. As the sun rose over the city, it painted the sky with hues of gold and pink, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is hope for a new day. The events that had transpired were tragic, but the truth had come to light. Justice had been served, and while the scars of the past would never completely heal, there was the promise of healing for the future. In the end, justice was served, but the scars remained. The lessons learned from this story will linger long after the headlines fade away. We are reminded that every decision we make, every action we take has consequences. Not just for ourselves, but for those around us. It's a reminder that the people we love are the ones we must protect, and that love should never be about control or manipulation. Choose love, choose trust, and above all, choose kindness. Because in the end, the greatest power we have is the ability to choose how we treat each other. Thank you for watching, and remember, take care of each other. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more gripping tales. Share this video with your friends and family, so they too can reflect on the importance of trust and the consequences of unchecked emotions. Together, let's spread awareness and make sure these lessons reach as many people as possible. Thank you for watching.